10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of This Is HCD. My name is Gerry Scullion and I'm a human-centred design practitioner based in Dublin, Ireland. In this episode, I caught up with a great friend of the podcast, Andy Polaine. Now, most of you will probably be familiar with Andy's work with Fjord and also as co-author of Service Design from Insights to Implementation book on Rosenfeld Media, a book that has become one of the most defining service design books over the last number of years. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. So I was hosting Service Design Days, a wonderful conference in Barcelona this year, and I had a whole lot of fun meeting the European service design community. It was a jam-packed few days for me and managed to capture some great conversations that all followed a similar theme to what myself and Andy covered in this episode. And that follows through from what I spoke about with John Thackara, which is an episode that we released recently. And that is that we need to consider not only what we produce, but how we actually produce it. And Andy's keynote was fantastic, and we speak about this in more detail. And he had some wonderful metaphors about how we have lost some of the natural cadence and craft through the new work processes like Agile and Lean. So also, before I jump into this episode, I want to let you know that I'm actually working on a very, very special newsletter for the podcast in the lead up to Christmas with lots of the world's best book companies and authors. So if you're not on the podcast newsletter, go over and sign up. This newsletter is going to include discounts and giveaways just in time for those Christmas stocking fillers. Right, I've done the sale. So let's get straight into this episode. So here we are, Andy Polaine. Warm welcome back to This Is HCD.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
You're now at the top of the league for the most appearances on the podcast. This is your third time, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll strike that off my bucket list now.
Absolutely. So look, we're coming from the Service Design Days conference in Barcelona, and yesterday you gave the opening keynote, which was really well received here, and it's still been spoken about this morning. So tell us a little bit about what you were chatting about. It was mindful service design. So
It was a talk around designing for the long term or long-term thinking and mindfulness. And it's kind of scratching my own itch in a way. I've seen a lot of the language around sort of sprints and, MVPs and being fast to market and fail fast and move fast and break things has a place, but it's also can get quite problematic if that's all the only language you have, which is just let's go as fast as we possibly can. Now, for some things it doesn't matter so much if you make a mistake on something that's not very important in life. But for services, which are really part of the infrastructure of society, so that's everything from welfare and healthcare and mobility and communications and so forth, and including social media. When those things break or are designed without thought of the long-term consequences, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
And that starts having a kind of massive effect. And so my plea was really to have a cadence where you can go fast and it's fine. And I had this metaphor of the 4 seasons of design. So, in spring, you've got the sort of early buds of an idea. And at that point in time, the designer's job is really also to kind of shield those early buds from being crushed by others. In summer is kind of launch time and everything's going great and everything sort of slightly gets out of control, like my garden at home.
yeah,
And then in autumn, you start paring stuff back, you start repairing things, you start harvesting, you sort of thinking about, what's happened here, and you start that process of reflection. And in winter, you stop. Right? The nice thing about, at least in Northern European winters, is you're forced to stop. And, the garden itself, so there was a whole metaphor about gardens, but the garden itself then, withdraws and everything kind of dies back. And there's this moment of reflection, and winter is traditionally quite a sort of internal reflecting time.
Yeah.
And it was more of a plea as much as anything to say, build this into your working life or your life in general, not just days, but weeks, sprints. Just make sure there's some of that time that you defend in order to have that kind of reflection time.
So where do you think the need for speed comes from?
Part of it's from, Silicon Valley and the startup movement, which is, the classic kind of hockey stick curve of growth, which is all about, can you grow fast enough to disrupt the incumbent quicker than the incumbent can change to defend against the disruption, and also, before you run out of investment money. And so there's this sort of constant thing about getting fast to market, and obviously digital has enabled that to be at speed. But what happens is the language around that and the kind of ways of thinking about that sort of perpetuate themselves. So you and I work in an industry where we're designing stuff, and there's always the pressure to do it quicker and faster, quicker and so forth. In turn, we expect all the tools and services that we use to be as quick as possible. And if I have to wait a week to order something, that's outrageous. I should be able to get it the next day and so forth. Which in turn, our expectations is someone else's problem who we're giving them less time. So, in general, we kind of perpetuate the cycle amongst ourselves.
So looking at the way people are currently working in all disciplines as regards to design, and they might be in an organization that's really, urging them to work quicker, what would you say to them to take the message back to their boss and say, actually, you know what, we need to factor in the need for reflection on what we're doing?
I know there will be plenty of designers in the audience going, well, that's all very well, that's a nice idea, but, we just don't have time for that. Yeah, but that's a bit like the whole sustainability argument of, well, that's great, but, where's the business case for it? So, well, there's things that you have to do. And the same is true with time. Time is also a limited resource, and you spend it where you deem important. And so if you say, this thing is really important to me, then you prioritize it and that gets defended. And, the same thing happens as soon as you have kids, for example. All the things where you say, well, I really have to stay late tonight to do this. That goes away, right? I got to pick my kid up from school. I'm sorry, I have to go. Everything else has to go around that immovable object.
So you have to that need is equivalent to that in that metaphor.
Well, I think you need to turn that space into an immovable object. Now, it doesn't have to be massively disruptive either. And in general, it makes people much more productive, gives them that extra time for the polish of work. But part of it's also thinking about where are things that I'm kind of hanging on to process, where, this is the way we have to do this, and I can't possibly move on to the next step until I've done this particular method or completed it in the way that I learned it and so forth. That kind of dogmatism can easily become a kind of procrastination where you don't want to move on to the next stage of synthesis or ideation, which is often a kind of psychologically a little bit of a kind of awkward stage sometimes, or difficult stage. Just one more interview, and if I could just get one more,
it makes the data better.
And it's like, just one more book from the library, and and it's all actually kind of procrastination often. And I think that you can save time. And research is important. I really believe in it, but there are areas where you can save time and think, I need to do that just enough, because for me, the period of reflection or time out is as important or more important than doing yet another kind of piece of whatever work I'm going to be doing.
So what do you say to people whose argument is that this is already included in the agile process in the retrospective?
It's great if it is, and if it's real. Sometimes I've seen those agile retros be quite sort of factual or sort of technical about whatever kind of the validation was and that's what we're going to do next.
Very macro.
Yeah, and they are very sort of tactical, and they work but people saying, I've been feeling like this, or I can't keep working like that, or I really need to spend some time on this, or I need to have kind of, the emotional human side of things. That stuff also needs to come up too and be in there. And I think that's perhaps a difference between, sort of design and engineering. And I don't mean that in a sort of dismissive way at all, just culturally a difference between the sort of emotional space that designers often need, and it's just like a clear headspace or a kind of bit of time out to reflect and let the kind of process digest and work, compared to something that's much more of a kind of just moving forward onto the next build.
So if you had, and you obviously do at Fjord, you're able to change the way people are working, and your role is in the evolution team. What would it look like if you were to include this in the design process? Like, just to give it a bit more granular clarity as regards when do you implement it and how often do you see it being implemented?
I imagine that many of my Fjordian colleagues would be listening to this and going, oh, come on, Andy, you're just making this up. We're working our asses off the whole time.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah, and I'm sure they are. And so that was what the talk was really about. And the reason why I call it about mindfulness, because mindfulness isn't necessarily about getting it right all the time. Mindfulness is about being aware. So if you can build it into the process. And so we had a team in Australia working on something, and they did this thing called lion time and tiger time, which I really liked. And I don't know if they've got this from somewhere else, but they had this thing where, tigers hunt on their own and lions hunt in packs. And so they would divide up the day and they'd say, okay, from this period of time, for this morning, we're in Tiger time. And, so that's, headphones on, I'm concentrating on the stuff I need to do. And then after lunch, we're going to have some lion time where we're going to have discussions about things.
So you're in a pack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, just being clear that that's how the team's going to work. And those also become sort of self-policing norms. So there'll be other things where people are saying, you need to leave now, Gerry, because you've told us that your yoga class is really important on Tuesday nights and you're going to miss it. And so that kind of thing gives a sort of behavioural permission to actually look after yourself.
So it extends beyond the delivery of a service. It extends to the employee experience and making sure that the well-being of the designer is actually being looked after.
Yeah, it is. And I think some of that, though, is, it becomes a personal thing, but if it's also then part of a team, it becomes part of the kind of project process and you get those kind of behavioural norms and cultural norms of this is how projects work, and then that becomes part of your process.
Yeah.
Now, some teams might go, we don't need this at all. We just kind of power through because we're so great. And that's fine if that works for them. But I have seen enough kind of sense of, I just need a bit of space from, not just from designers, say, within Fjord, but also in client teams and stuff, where it's clear that there's just too much going on.
Yeah.
And everyone kind of benefits from it. It could just be a couple of hours. It could just be as disciplined as making sure you actually go out for lunch and don't eat at your desk.
I know, I gave a talk recently and I nicked a quote from Marc which you reminded me of in one of the earlier podcasts about we shape our tools and therefore our tools shape us. So where do you think this approach fits in within, the design thinking process and the ability to alter it and how that relates to design craft?
I think one of the big misconceptions about design thinking is that the idea that the thinking happens up front and then you just get on and do stuff. And I think that's happened because it's still kind of seen in terms of a kind of industrial process. So we do some planning and then we go into kind of manufacture.
Which is like a waterfall approach anyway.
Yeah. So whereas as any person knows, but certainly as any designer knows, that's a third of the thinking. Most of the thinking's happening whilst you're doing.
Yeah.
And I often say, as an example, if you've ever had to have a difficult conversation with someone, you had to break up with someone, you've had to fire someone, and you've lain awake all night going, so I'm going to say that, and then she's going to say this, and then I'm going to say that. And as, it actually happens, and you open your mouth, and it all just goes completely off the rails. It doesn't go to plan at all. That happens a lot, right? So you're designing something, and you realise, we've designed it. Now I've actually made that tangible. We've designed ourselves into a corner, and I have to kind of rethink that. Or that brilliant idea that was a kind of platonic ideal of an idea, as soon as it's made real, it doesn't make sense at all. Now I see it doesn't make sense. Or those three things that I thought were separate are now one thing. All of that kind of reflective practice, it's the Donald Schoen stuff, happens whilst you're designing. And there's a whole process of kind of doing that goes on. And so
that hand-to-mind connection.
Yeah, and you do need that. And that's also what Donald Schoen talked about. You do need this kind of process of I'm going to plan, I'm going to think, and then I'm going to do some doing, and I'm going to be doing some thinking whilst I'm doing. And then I'm going to look at what I've done and think about it.
Yeah.
And then I do some more doing. And if you try and short-circuit that too much, all you're doing is just doing, and the lack of long-term thinking whilst you're sprinting like that, I mean, it's like kind of running along just looking at your feet. But at some point, you're going to hit the wall. You hit the wall,
Yeah, so you need to look where you're going. There was a great story you told, and I was definitely able to connect with the story. I remember the old days of when you used to use Photoshop and you'd add a blur. In my case, I was zip file time, so you'd hit save, and then we'd go for lunch. And then we'd come back from Spar. I was in NCAD, obviously, there was a Spar shop there, and I would literally be able to go the 5-minute walk down, get a roll, like a sandwich for anyone in America, and bring it back, and it would just be in time to collect the saved file.
Yeah.
But in that time, I was able to reflect on what I was doing in the work. How can we incorporate that type of thinking into the day-to-day?
So that goes back to the McLuhan quote, right? Which is, of this thing of we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. That, if you've got a tool, if you're using a process or a tool that has some kind of enforced moment of kind of pause in it because the progress bar is rendering, then you're forced to kind of think about something. I used to read a book quite often, and it's often a book related to maybe what I was doing. And it was John Warwicker from Tomato who said, I used to really like it when computers were slow because I'd be able to think about things.
Yeah.
When you've got tools that are kind of incredibly fast and you just be able to kind of work very, very quickly without any kind of enforced break of any kind, then your tools shape your thinking. Right? And then if you start using language around sprinting and so forth, and again, I'm not demonizing sprinting, it's a very good format, but what I'm saying is the language also sets up the mental model and all the kind of ways you think about that stuff. And the reason why I put the Usain Bolt quote up there, fastest man in the world, and the quote from him is about sleep and how important sleep is to him.
Absolutely. I remember when we caught up the other night, I was telling you the story about John Cleese, who's very famous. He's a member of Monty Python. He was writing the script for Fawlty Towers, and he wrote it, and then he lost it before he had to submit it to the BBC. And then he was forced to rewrite it. And then a number of years later, when he was going through a divorce, he found the first script. And he saw that the first script that he'd written was not as good as the one that he rewritten with, the second script. And his argument was the subconscious worked in that time in the difference between the first script and the second script and was considerably better. So I guess I'm seeing those kind of parallels between the stories in terms of being able to take that time to reflect. So what role do you think subconscious, I guess, plays in the design process?
I think there's a massive role in that. And I'm married to a psychotherapist, so but I think it's also, I always say I've done a lot of writing, and I used to have a design column for a design magazine called Desktop in Australia, and every month I'd have to turn out 1,000 words. And I've also done long form writing, like book and PhD and stuff. And with those things, the thing I really learned was you do your planning, you've got a sort of an idea about what you want to write, and then you do the writing. And whilst you're doing the writing, you don't do any editing at all. And that's really important. And that's where the kind of raw material is coming out, and you're just letting yourself go. And there's a great book called Writing Down the Bones by a woman called Natalie Goldberg. And she talks about letting yourself write shit.
Yeah.
And you really have to, like, the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, I'm literally having to override the inner editor going, this is rubbish. And go, yeah, this is rubbish, and that's okay.
But power through it.
Yeah, and power through it. And then, having done the writing, and preferably with a little bit of time in between, you go back and you restructure, or you edit. And so you go, well, my writing went kind of off plan, but actually where I've gone to is much more interesting, so I'm going to restructure. Or my writing went off plan, I really need to edit that back to get it back to the structure. But that process of separating those two is really important, because that's how you avoid analysis paralysis. So if you've ever been a person who's sat there for an hour writing the first paragraph or the first sentence of something you've had to write, which is most of us, that's what's going on, right? You're muddling those two processes up. And I'm convinced that those two need to be kept separate. And that's part of what I guess I'm arguing about with this.
I think that's a nice way to wrap up the conversation. I'm going to put a link to the presentation in the show notes. For anyone who wants to contact you, tell us how they might reach out to you. So
I'm Polaine almost everywhere. So Apolaine on Twitter. You'll find me on LinkedIn and
the Slack channel.
And the Slack channel too. Yeah.
You drift in and out of the Slack channel. You're like an enigma. You
just at me in the Slack channel. I have a bit of a discipline. That's actually a mindfulness thing. So I think that was one of those Tristan Harris things actually about time well spent. But I have a thing where a policy about I only set notifications from people, not machines, on my phone. So if it's any kind of messaging thing, that gets through. If it's directed at me, if it's just some kind of nudge from some app, it doesn't come through, it gets turned off.
That might be another thing that we chat about in the podcast in the future. Andy, great chatting to you again.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here.
So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you'd like to be part of the conversation or community, hop on over to thisishcd.com, where you can request to join the Slack channel and help shape future episodes and connect with other designers around the world. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.